Hello, today I want to talk to you about the benefits of touring a site where you have a project and looking at all of it in detail. Now the situation will vary for different projects. I'm going to give you some details about a particular site where this was particularly useful, and this may give you some interesting insight into why you might want to do that. Now it does depend of course on your project and time scale and so on. What I found was the time invested in looking all over a site really paid off on a couple of occasions. So I'm going to talk about one case study in this video, and I'm going to record another video that will explain the other case study. So as I say, it'll depend and vary from project to project. If your project is, for example, 600 sites in another country, you're not going to be able to go and look over all of them, obviously. If, however, you have one site to look at, or a small number, and depending on circumstances, you may find it is really beneficial to actually go and have a look. Now, also, I'm going to mention telephones because this was what the project was about, was installing telephones. But I want you to bear in mind that what I'm talking about isn't technology specific. I was installing telephones, you may be installing something else, doing something totally different. But some of the lessons from this could be applicable to yourself and your projects. Right, first of all, the site that I'm going to talk about was about 2,000 users, we were told at the beginning of the project. And it was a large site, a factory, and had multiple buildings. So it's fairly compact. It looks, it's a block you can see on the map, it is a size, but it's fairly compact. What I actually did was I toured the whole site. I engaged with the facilities team, and one of the facilities team came round with the site with me. I was very fortunate to have somebody who had worked on that site for tens of years. He knew every nook and cranny of the site, and he also knew the history and what had been in place before, what we could see today, and that was useful in some ways to know that as well. So he's really helpful. And what I particularly did was I looked at every telephone, literally with my own eyes, saw every telephone. The only tools I needed with me was a notebook and the camera in my phone. I wasn't doing anything technically, but I was looking at every phone and making a note of the phone number and probably the name associated with it. Now, the benefits of doing that included the fact that I had seen every phone. I knew where they were. I could have already seen whether there were any visible issues that might have arisen. You're in each of these offices, you're seeing the phones, and you might see, fax machine or conference phones, various things that might be an issue. Those aren't big issues, but for example, if you tour the site and you come across an area that is an explosion hazard, well, that does make a difference for you. So, but the key thing is for me is that by seeing all around the site myself in person, I could see if there are issues that I could spot that other people might not have. And also what was really key for this project is I knew how many phones there were. I was going around the whole site, every nook and cranny, every office, every place there were telephones, and was able to actually make a note of each one. Interestingly also, because we were migrating from switch circuit telephony to IPT, and the new IPT phones would connect to the data network, the LAN. It was interesting to see where there were offices where there was no LAN connection at all. There was a glass workshop and didn't have a computer, didn't have a LAN connection, nothing. So that's the sort of thing that you could spot by going there in person, and it would just be something nobody else would notice. So anyway, so visible issues, knowing how many phones, also you know the geography of the site, you know where the buildings are, you know the distances, you know how far it is to walk from this building to that building. If you need to ask somebody to go from building K to building L to have a look at something for you, you might assume on paper they're right next to each other, but in reality they could be a long way apart. So that can be really useful to know for the future as well. Specific areas can be useful to see as well, in as much as this particular factory site had clean areas where special precautions were taken to make sure the product wasn't contaminated. So that meant that you had to enter the building and go through a changing room where you had to put on special overalls, special boots, special hairnet, and it was very important that the protocols and the procedure for passing into the clean area was adhered to at all times, and obviously the reverse as you come out. So that was really useful. Also, of course, in clean areas you can't necessarily use ordinary telephones. You might need to have special telephones of some sort. This site did have some rooms where the telephones were the sort of sterile telephones you'd have in an operating theatre in a hospital. As mentioned before, there may be areas that are hazards, explosive risks, where special precautions need to be taken. And it isn't just about what equipment is required in these places, but it's also about your team and what they need to expect before they go to one of these buildings and what precautions they need to take. So, for example, I've been to factory sites where mobile phones aren't allowed on site at all because of the risk of explosion. And so it's useful for somebody to know in advance what they can and cannot take on site with them. The other thing, by touring the whole site, is, and this is something that is more obvious, but I'll mention it anyway, and that is seeing the data centers and wiring closets on the site. One of the things that you can explore by actually going there in person is, does the room feel unusually warm? Does it feel particularly cold? Cold is not a problem, but if you're going into a data center or wiring closet that feels warm, one of the questions you're going to be asked later on, and you should know the answer anyway, but is what is the heat load that you're going to be installing in that room? Because clearly if it's a room that's warm already, the air conditioning is struggling, and that's something that you would only know by going in there. The other thing is whether it's a tidy room, untidy room, hazards that you will find out just by looking in the room. And the other thing also is rack space, because if you know in advance if there's a designated space in the racks that your equipment is going to go, then you can look at that particular place. But otherwise, you can see whether there is spare rack space for the equipment to go, how tight it is, how much space there is. So that's something you can really understand better if you have gone there in person. Now, another advantage, obviously, of going in person is you're going to meet people. Inevitably, people are going to think, oh, who's he? And they're going to ask your companion, the facilities person who's walking around with you. And you can say, well, I'm managing the project to install the new phone system. And it gives a face to the project, and people may have heard what was going on and you're putting a face on it. But you're also showing that you're not afraid to go in person and have a look at the site. And I think you get a lot of respect for the fact you spent the time to actually talk to the real people who use these facilities, the telephones, the computers, whatever it is you're installing. So you can get real benefit from just physically being seen to be looking around the building or the site. So some of the takeaways from this exercise include, in this case, knowing the actual requirements, because I mentioned at the beginning of this video that we were told that there were 2,000 users on this site. Actually, it was 2,300. And when I went round in person, counting the phones, there were 1,000. So we're talking about less than half the figure that we were originally given. That's less than half of what's written into the scope for the project. Now, there's a whole discussion can be had about how that arose, and I'm going to record another video about that in future, if I haven't already. It's about the levers process, joiners process, levers process, so watch out for that. One of the other benefits of actually walking around the site is you can talk with authority. So somebody says something about what there is in a particular room or whatever, or we can't do that because of such and such. You've been there, you've seen the room, you've had a look around, and you can say, oh yeah, I know what you mean, I saw that when I was there. Or you can say, yeah, I don't think that's going to be a problem. It also means that you can anticipate risks and issues, as I think I mentioned earlier, just by looking at all the site, every room, every office. There are things that you will spot that will go on the risk register. There are things you'll spot that may be issues already, and you may not have realized otherwise. It also, as in this case, where the number of phones that were required was less than half what we were told, there are real costs associated with discovering that. So that's really important. And in this particular case, of course, the scope had to be redefined because of the reduction in numbers compared to what we were expecting. Now, this could have been really serious in other circumstances. I mean, obviously, on the face of it, less phones means less cost. Wonderful. But actually, we were fortunate because we were migrating to a company or corporate cloud for IPT, not somebody else's cloud like one of the big carriers. Because one of the big problems with this would be that if you have negotiated a deal with a carrier for 2,300 phones, and then you go and say, oh, whoops, we only need 1,000, they're going to say, oh, whoops, it's going to cost you more per unit than originally quoted. So that can get really quite messy. We were fortunate not to have that situation. So I would say really consider investing the time in touring a site if you have a hunch that it's going to be feasible for you to do it and there are going to be the benefits. And the other thing I would say also is do this at the beginning, as early as you can. You'll be enthusiastic at the beginning. You'll think, oh, new project. Oh, let's have a look and see what we've got here. But the key thing is that the benefit you get from touring the site only comes from the point when you did it. And in the other case study I'll talk about in another video, we didn't realize we had a problem till much later. In that example, it's an office building, there are no explosive hazards, no sort of complications like in a factory, but we had a big problem. So watch out for that other video. So anyway, the final point is, as I say, consider the benefit of touring a site completely. A lot of people would think it wasn't worth their time. A lot of people think it wouldn't, the cost benefit analysis wouldn't be good for it. I think it makes a lot of sense. If it's a reasonable single site or small number of sites where you can actually do it, then I would strongly recommend it. If you've got too many sites, then you can't. But you might want to ask somebody else in the project team to do the equivalent for you. And I think that's where I'll leave that for now. So thanks very much for listening. And if you have any comments, please let me know. I'd be interested to see what you may have experienced yourself. Thank you and goodbye.